Hey everybody. As a car enthusiast, I watch a ton of YouTube videos of car reviews all the time. And, one of my favorite kind of reviews is when the owner is just talking through the car, their experience, the pros and cons, um, what is it like, what do they not like, that kind of stuff. So I thought I'd make one of my own, and especially because I have the opportunity here to compare and contrast two really neat cars. Um, Now, here in the United States, a lot of people have not heard of TVR, especially the TVR Cerbera, but these cars are now 25 years old, which means you can import them now. And I thought, what better way to help show people the TVR than to compare it with another car that is pretty well known. And, obviously I own both of these cars because I love both of them. So I thought it would be really cool to do a compare and contrast of the Porsche 911 versus the TVR Cerbera. Both of these cars are actually, they actually have a lot in common, but they do have a lot of differences too, and they both have a lot of really unique quirks. I mean, one of them is a hand-built British car with crazy styling, and the other one is a German car, factory built, with the German quirks and the engine in the wrong place. So both of these cars are actually really unique. So I thought it'd be really cool to do a compare and contrast video. Now, this is my first kind of long YouTube video, so I'm literally just holding my cell phone camera here. And I do have this little silly looking microphone, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me okay. But this is mainly going to be a talking video. I'm going to talk about the cars and kind of show them to you. But I think you'll still find it interesting. Maybe later, if I get some camera equipment or something, maybe I could do some driving videos or something like that. But for right now, I'm just going to kind of take you around these cars and tell you what I think and the similarities, the differences, the pros and cons of each, and what do I like and what do I not like about them. And I'm going to kind of bounce around from one car to the other as I compare, the different parts to each other. So let me start off by just sort of doing a quick overview of the general, exterior and interior styling and what are these cars. So this is a 2001 Porsche 911. This one is the Carrera 2, which is the rear wheel drive, which is what I wanted. Very similar to the TVR. I wanted its rear wheel drive. I like these simple, basic sports cars with very little driver aids and very little electronics. And these cars from the late 90s and early 2000s, they kind of have that. They have very simple styling, sleek lines. They have very few electronic driver aids. The Porsche has a couple of them. The TVR has nothing. So that's one big difference right there. But just in general, cars from this time period, the late 90s, early 2000s, they were smaller, lighter. I mean, the styling of these two cars in particular is so smooth and elegant. I mean, there's not a straight line on either one of these cars. So that's a reason why I tend to like vehicles from this era in general. And I mean, really, that's kind of the first thing you notice when you look at these two cars is just overall that clean, simple styling. And of course, Porsche 911s have looked like that for forever. That's how they look. They have that simple, clean styling and simple lines, and this TVR does it really well too. Of course, the TVR doesn't even have door handles, so it's even smoother. So how are these two similar? So one thing you can tell right off the bat is these cars are a lot smaller than the cars of today. Well, especially American cars, the Mustangs, Camaros, those are pretty big. But even the new Porsche 911s, those things are huge compared to this car. When I'm driving this 911 here in Texas, I mean, it's dwarfed by the pickup trucks and the SUVs. I mean, this thing is a tiny, tiny car. And, the 911s also have the turbo body or the wide body that comes in certain models. This is not that. This is the narrow body because it's the simple rear wheel drive option. So this car is smaller than even some 911s. And the TVR is even tinier. These cars are actually the same footprint, but when I say the TVR is tinier, I mean really it's the space inside. So I mean, you can see here the TVR's roof line is much lower. I mean, you can't even see the Porsche's roof looking that way. So you got a lot more headroom in the 911 there. The actual footprint of the cars is actually pretty similar. So I've got them parked pretty much lined up, almost bumper to bumper there. The Porsche has those little bumperettes sticking out at the back. But you can see there the trunks pretty much line up. And in the front here, it's pretty much the same. These cars are about the same length. So you would think they would be, or they would feel the same size, but they don't. The TVR feels much smaller because the roof line is so much lower that you get kind of packed in there. I'll open the doors in just a second. But the Porsche kind of feels cramped. But then you get into the TVR and you realize how much space there actually is in the Porsche. Okay, so we talked about the overall styling and the amount of space on the interior. But let's get a little more info on what these are. So the Porsche 911, this one, of course, as I mentioned, is rear-wheel drive, so it's the simplest, back to basics 911. It's just the engine, rear-wheel drive, and a couple of safety systems, and that's it. Obviously, the Porsche is rear-engined, so it's a small car. It's lightweight. It only weighs about 2,900 pounds, but of course, the engine is in the back. So the majority of the weight is, in the back of the car. You've got the engine right about here, actually behind the rear axle, and this body sticks out quite a bit after that wheel. So you have that kind of classic shape of the body swooping down, and it sticks out quite a bit, which kind of looks funny at first, but it just looks really sporty because it puts all that weight right over the rear wheels, just helping the car to go, and it just gives it that stance and that look that not a lot of cars have. And then the transmission, or the transaxle, so the engine's about there, and then the transaxle's right about there, right where the wheels are. And of course it has a little tunnel in there going to the gear lever. And then in the front you basically have just a couple of radiators, and you've got some luggage space, and I'll show you that in a second. So your trunk is up front, and the fuel filler is up front too. And there's kind of a funny story about that, and a funny story about the TVR's fuel filler as well. Now the TVR is kind of the opposite. Oh yeah, I forgot the suspension though. In the Porsche, because you have that rear engine, has a different suspension setup. So it's got a multi-link suspension in the back here where the engine is, and then in the front it's just a simple McPherson strut. But that's really all it needs because most of the weight is in the back. And so that light front end gives this car a really, really light steering, and it's perfect steering feel. You know, this car has some of the best steering that I've ever felt, and the car feels so lightweight. And with the engine in the back, it does give it some kind of weird handling quirks. Like, I mean, you don't have to be a race car driver. You can be an average driver and still feel that the weight is in the back. And if you go around a corner too fast, you can feel it. And the car kind of wants to swing around. You're aware that that car is different. The TVR is much more traditional sports car. It's much more almost race car like, really. So the Porsche has basically a standard kind of body. It's a unibody structure like most cars. So the frame is really the body. The TVR, though, like a lot of race cars, I mean, like NASCARs, like GT cars, the TVR has a frame that's almost like a three-dimensional tubular steel frame. It's got a really thick backbone that runs along the middle of the car, and the engine and transmission, everything, of course, bolts to that. But you have this huge transmission tunnel, which actually you can see it better looking back here. That transmission tunnel is huge because the engine is pushed far back into the chassis. And so the engine actually sits behind the wheels here, which makes it basically a front but mid-engined car. And then it has rear-wheel drive, of course, like the Porsche. But the TVR, again, has no electronic aids, no traction control, no stability control, no anti-lock brakes, none of that stuff. And no airbags either. It has nothing. This is basically if you took a sports car or muscle car from the 60s and you gave it a modern body with modern technology and just made it look pretty neat. That's the TVR. It's like a modern day, like 60s sports car or muscle car. So continuing with that theme of the placement of everything in the structure, I mentioned that the TVR was much more like a classic sports car or muscle car. So you have that long hood, that classic long hood, the low roof line, the simple kind of coupe shape, and then you have this long trunk. So overall, the shape of this car, the TVR, kind of reminds me of just a classic, British or American sports car or muscle car. The long hood, the short deck. It's just classic, but also with crazy modern styling. That's just what I think of when I look at the TVR. Also, of course, that low roof line gives it that look, and one of my favorite features of the car is just this swoop right here where it kind of swoops back and goes into the door. That's like really unique, I think. Of course, with the TVR, it's much more of a normal setup. So you got your trunk in the back. With the Porsche, of course, the trunk is in the front. The TVR suspension is a little different from the Porsches. The TVR has, it's independent just like the Porsche, but the TVR has double wishbone suspension with coil-over shocks at all four corners. So again, it's very race car. The Porsche has that multi-link and the McPherson strut at the front. So both of these cars handle really good. They handle differently, but they both handle really good. The TVR steering is super quick. It's, I think, 2 turns from lock to lock. The Porsche is much more kind of a normal feel. In the TVR, if you just barely move the steering wheel, the car starts moving. So it is a little bit nerve-wracking if you don't know what you're doing. You kind of have to keep your mind set on driving With the Porsche, it just feels much more like a typical car. Um, so the engines, the Porsche has a fairly unique engine. It's a flat six. I mean, only Porsche and Subaru, as far as I know, are the only companies that still use flat engines, or a boxer engine. And of course the engine's in the back, so now you got a couple of weird things going on. The Porsche engine, it's a 3.4 liter. This is the earlier 996 version, so this particular engine kind of revs up pretty high, like all the way up to 7,000, and you have to rev it up that high to get the power, but it comes in pretty linearly. I think the more RPMs you give it, the more power you get, and it kind of feels much more similar to a lot of the earlier Porsches that a lot of people liked, the air-cooled ones where you rev it up to get more power. Later versions of this car, they came out with a bigger engine which had more torque, but this car you kind of have to rev it out. So it makes, I think the Porsche makes about 300 horsepower and I think about 274 foot-pounds of torque. So it's powerful, it's fast. Doesn't sound like a lot compared to modern cars, but remember, this thing only weighs 2,900 pounds. So this can do 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. And I don't remember the 0 to 100. And the top speed is about 175, I think. Now the TVR has a V8 engine. This is a 4.2 liter. It's naturally aspirated. And the engine it's not like an American V8. This engine is based on Formula One engines of the time. So yeah, I mean, when we look at the engine in a second here, you'll see it doesn't even look like the typical engine. This engine also revs up to about 7,000 RPM, and the TVR is more powerful than the Porsche. It makes about 360 horsepower and about 320 foot-pounds of torque. The TVR has a 5-speed, while the Porsche has a 6-speed. And the TVR is definitely faster than the Porsche. The TVR will do 0 to 60 in about 4 seconds. And it goes, I think, 185. So higher top speed and higher 0 to 60. I mean, without a doubt, the TVR is faster. The TVR is also way louder too. So this car has an aftermarket exhaust from ACT, but it does have CATs, catalytic converters, although they are also, I think, ACT ones. They're like a high flow or a sports CAT. But the TVRs are just louder in general. The Porsche is kind of loud when you first start it up. It has like a nice raspy startup sound, makes all kinds of noises. And it sounds good, but it definitely sounds different from a normal car. It's got that Porsche sound. And neither of these cars are turbocharged, so you don't have turbos kind of eating up the noise. But the Porsche sounds good, but it's definitely nowhere near as cool of a sound as the TVR makes. And it's definitely not as loud. I mean, even if you put an aftermarket exhaust on the Porsche, it still would not sound anywhere near like a TVR does. So the TVR's got that sound and that drama going on. You know, let me go back to the styling for a second. You know, I mentioned that the TVR kind of reminds me of old classic sports cars. I didn't talk about the Porsche very much. The Porsche, you know, when I first saw these, I wasn't exactly in love with them. I thought they looked kind of weird, kind of funky, It's almost an egg shape. But the more that I look at this car, the more I just see it just has this sporty look to it. And there's something about that shape that it really grows on you. And with the body hanging out the back here, I mean, it has that stance like it wants to go, and then it has that sleek roof line with that curvy window, and you got that little hump here over the wheel, same thing as the TVR right here. And then the front just kind of dips down, and you have those little wings over the headlights. And this shape, the more that I look at it, it really just kind of grows on me. It's both sporty and elegant at the same time. I mean, there's not, actually both of these cars kind of have that. There's not a lot of cars that can really do it this well, like blend sporty with elegant. And so, you know, one car I think of when I talk about that aggressive and beautiful styling kind of blended together is like an old Aston Martin, like the DB5 that James Bond drove in the old Bond movies. That's kind of what this car reminds me of, even though this is not a British car, it's not an Aston Martin, you know, it's totally different. But this car just reminds me of that. It's that the curvy styling and the way that the roofline kind of swoops down towards the back, and then the whole body it just kind of curves into each other. You've got the fenders here coming over to the lights, and then even the way the front of the car curves in. You know, some people don't like that because of the overhang, but I actually think there's just something about this shape that just looks better and better the more that you look at it. And it reminds me of the older Porsches as well. It just has that shape that they don't really put into cars anymore. You know, the newer cars are, you know, like the headlight, the little hump there is a lot flatter because of aerodynamics, and, you know, they're trying to get gas mileage. It just doesn't have this kind of a bubble shape that these older cars had. And yeah, like I said, the more that I look at this shape, the more I start to like it. And it just grows and grows on you. But the Porsche has that kind of classic look, and part of that is because, you know, it is in a way a classic because they've been using that same body since the car came out in the mid 60s. So when you look at the Porsche, it just has that almost classic styling. And like I said, it's both sporty and elegant at the same time. The TVR kind of has that too, but it definitely leans a lot more towards the sporty and aggressive look with that low roofline and the swoop here, like it's, you know, like the wind is pushing it back. It's definitely a bit more aggressive on the front. You have all those lights, the little light pods in the grille. You know, there's a line there in the fender for the heat to escape. You've got all those lights there, and kind of an upper grille and lower grille. The Porsche kind of has that too. It's got that line through the grills there. But the TVR is definitely leaning a little bit more towards the aggressive side. But the TVR also has that somewhat aggressive and elegant thing going on too, because of the fact that it takes that classic long hood and short deck shape, but it blends it with these curves. So yeah, overall, I love the styling of both of these cars. Oh, you know, one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about the power and the weight and all that stuff was the TVR's weight. You know, the reason that the TVR is faster than the 911 is not just because it has more horsepower and torque, but also it weighs a lot less. So the Porsche is a lightweight car. I mean, 2,900 pounds. But the TVR is even lighter. The TVR only weighs 2,400 pounds. I mean, that's Mazda Miata and McLaren F1 weight. I mean, there's not that many cars that weigh 2,400 pounds. But that's kind of the secret to TVR's speed. So yeah. Alright, so we spent a lot of time looking at the exterior styling, so let's move on to the interior. Let's start with the Porsche. So I kind of mentioned that the TVR is faster, the TVR is louder, you know, it kind of sounds like I like the TVR a lot more than the Porsche, but let's wait and see, because we're going to move on to an area that the Porsche kind of has it beat in some ways, and the TVR has the Porsche beat in some other ways. So with that, let's take a look at the interior. Okay. So first off here, this is the 996 911. This does have leather mostly everywhere. The seats are leather. The dashboard is not leather, though. That's basically plastic, like most cars. There are a lot more features in here than the TVR. So right off the bat, you've got memory seats right there, which I love, because, you know, you go to a mechanic and change the oil, and they move the seat around, and you can just never get it back into the same spot again, and it just feels weird. I hate that. So the Porsche has memory seats. Another cool thing here is you've got the gauges all in a row there, and they're all analog, which I love. That's, you know, again, another reason I like these cars is the old school styling and the kind of back to the basics feel. Hopefully it's not too dark in here. So some people don't like these 996s because of the, I guess you could say, cheap plastic sort of look. For example, these buttons are all kind of plasticky. But the thing is, everything in here is actually pretty tight, and I mean, it all still works. You know, when you touch these buttons, yeah, it's plastic, but it's still there and it still works perfect, like it's brand new. And I actually don't mind that. So in here it does have a CD player, and it's got automatic climate control. One thing I like about these Porsches is the availability of aftermarket stuff. Like this here is a phone mount, a magnetic phone mount, which is made just for this car, so it bolts in there with a screw and doesn't interfere with anything, that doesn't have any extra holes or anything like that. So that's the kind of stuff you can get for these cars, because they're, you know, a lot more mass produced than the TVR was. So you can find a lot of, you know, stuff like this when you need it. Analog gauges, like I mentioned. So, and they're laid out in the classic way, kind of like the older Porsches. You have this 4-spoke steering wheel like the older Porsches too. I kind of like this one. They do have a 3-spoke, more sportier wheel, but to me, this reminds me of the older ones. Just like all Porsches, so one quirk here is you got the key on the left-hand side because of, you know, the old school Le Mans racing, when they ran to their car and stepped in there, so you could start the car and stick your seatbelt on, or you could put it in gear at the same time as you're turning that key and get a little advantage. So key is on the left-hand side, so that's one little quirk there. Got your kind of leather or Alcantara roof liner up here. Sorry it's so dark. Does have a sunroof. This car, unlike the TVR, does have airbags, so it is maybe a little bit safer, I suppose. One advantage that this car does have over the TVR is just the amount of space in here. I mean, even though this is a small car, still it's not uncomfortable. When I sit in these seats, I'm pretty comfy. Although I have to say, if I go on a long trip, then my back will start to hurt. But in general, for the most part, these seats are very comfy. It does have automatic climate control. You just set it and forget it. You know, you got your stereo right there. It's an old school CD player stereo, but it still works. And then down here I have some extra equipment for the it's kind of like an extra sound improvement setup or amplifier. I actually don't even use that very much. One thing you might notice is that this just isn't a luxury car. You know, some people think of Porsches as luxury cars, but I think of them as sports cars, especially the 911, and especially the 911 from this era. There's not much in here. I mean, you do have, you know, some buttons. You got your traction control off button, and a few other things. You got power windows and all that stuff, and your light switch. But other than that, there's not much in here. All the stuff is either for the climate control or the sound down there. So there's actually not a whole lot of buttons, and it's just simple. And there's no big, giant, colorful screen kind of glaring at you. There's no beeps. You know, when you turn the car on or if you open the door, it really doesn't beep much at you. You know, it doesn't have any safety things beeping at you. There's no cameras. There's no radar. There's none of that stuff. It's just a driver's car. You know, you just get in it and you drive, and if you're a good driver, you can have a lot of fun with this 911. The steering again is so good. Because this car is so lightweight, this steering is just perfect, and it's hydraulic steering. You know, it's got that old school feel, and you can feel a lot through this wheel. And I mean, when you're on the highway or going around corners, it doesn't matter. Either way, this car is just so nice to drive and steer, and it's so smooth. And actually on that's one of the big advantages that this car has over the TVR is, I guess, the word smooth. And what I mean is that the way that this engine runs and revs up, it is so smooth. It's almost like a turbine engine, like an airplane. It's just smooth. The way that the gear shifter works and the gas and the clutch, the way that everything works together is just perfect. I mean, it really doesn't take much to get used to driving this car, because everything is matched together so well. And that's that German quality in engineering. I mean, the car is just matched together. The 300 horsepower is just enough to make this car fast and fun, but it's not enough to be scary or to cause you to, you know, lose control and slide all over. It's just enough, and it's just perfect. The steering being so great, the gas and the clutch work together really well. It's easy to downshift, it's easy to match revs. The transmission is pretty smooth too. I mean, it is it's a good feeling lever right here. It's very easy to shift and get into the right gear. Although I say that, but also at the same time, because this is connected with cables, because your transaxle is in the back, you know, this is just connected via cables. So it does have a tiny bit of slop in it, you know, more than the TVR, because the TVR's transmission is, you know, directly under the gear lever. So there's a little bit of slop in here just because of the cables, but even still, you can just get into these gears so smoothly, and you never have to worry about, you know, missing a shift or something in this car. It's just perfect. And I hope you can hear this sound. I mean, listen to this sound. I hope you're not getting dizzy with me moving my camera phone around. You know, I'm holding it with one hand, so I'll try to stay more steady. But listen to this sound. That's just, I mean, it's so cool. I mean, awesome. So another thing, you want to know proof? You want proof that this is a sports car? No cup holders. The later Porsches had cup holders here in the dash that would pop out, little plastic things. But this car has no cup holders because sports car. Also, there's no, there is an airbag, but there is no glove box. Again, because sports car. And that's actually the same as the TVR. The TVR has no cup holders and no glove box. This car does have little storage pockets right here in the door. So you can store, I got my phone cable and my insurance in there. So that's basically your glove box. The TVR has a little pocket here too, but it is way smaller. One of my favorite things about this car is this little bitty light right there. That light, when the door is shut, kind of shines here onto the console, the dashboard, and you can kind of see the keys and the light switch. So even though this is a pretty old car, you know, you do still have some lighting in here, and it's just enough light that you can see it when you're driving in the dark. So yeah, there you go. Let me turn this on for a second here. Okay, I got my key out. One of the things I like about this car is the way these lights work. So, I mean, over here where you got your low fuel warning, you have that red. It's not just red, but the red just lights up. And same thing here with that high coolant warning. That little red part lights up all by itself, which is kind of cool. It does have the little oil checking gauge here in the dashboard, so you don't even have to go over there and check your oil. It just lights up here in the dash for you. One of the cool things I like about this car is just the colors of these lights, these orange and red lights here, and also in there. I don't know, it just reminds me of like an old fighter jet, like a stealth bomber or something like that. I mean, not that I know what their dashboards look like, but it just makes me think of that for some reason. You know, these orange and red lights, there's just something cool about it. And then the gauges would light up too. Automatic controls for the climate. And then something really funky here. You have cassette tape holders. So go 80s and 90s. Okay. Let's look at the back. Oh, you know, one thing I forgot to mention was the ergonomics in general. It's just easy to fit in there and to get to everything. The TVR is quite a bit more cramped because the TVR has a much larger tunnel here in the middle because the transmission is right there. But in this 911, you know, you just have that small tunnel there. If it was all-wheel drive, it would have a little drive line there, but this one doesn't have that. You do have a dead pedal and plenty of space, so when you're driving, you can rest your left foot. If you're going around corners, you can brace yourself. I mean, the whole car in general is just really nice and comfy. I do like this too. Only one hand. That's pretty neat. With the TVR, you have to use two hands to do that. So in the back, there's these seats are small and they fold down to give you more luggage space there. But there is enough space to fit an actual car seat back there, so I take my daughter for rides and she can fit safely there in the car seat. Now let's go take a look at the TVR. Okay. So you can see the one nice advantage that the TVR has here is the materials in here. Oh, sorry, it's so dark. So everything in here is covered basically in leather. You got aluminum, switch gear, aluminum knobs. Everything in here is made by TVR. So you got the aluminum knobs there for the lights, the heater controls. The gauges are, nice analog gauges, just like the Porsche. This TVR does not have an airbag, so the steering wheel here is just nice small spoke. It's only one spoke, but there's no airbag, so they can kind of make it look however they want. You have these gauges underneath the steering wheel, which is kind of cool because they're, you can see them from almost any angle. Get your oil gauge and coolant temperature gauge in there. But just, again, the big advantage here over the Porsche is the number one, the crazy styling in here. Everything in here is kind of a smooth, curvy surface, and it's all covered in leather, and they come in all kinds of different colors. And all the switches and buttons in here are all made bespoke by TVR. Now again, because the engine is pushed all the way back as far as it can, and the transmission is here, and then also the frame is here around the transmission, so you have that big tubular steel frame going through here. So this transmission tunnel is huge, but it's actually kind of neat because you sit in here almost like it's almost like a cocoon that you're sitting in here, and then the gear lever is right there, and you can almost rest your arm on the console here. The gear lever is right where you need it, right next to the steering wheel. Now there's not as much space for your feet because this tunnel kind of goes to the right a little bit as you move up to the engine. There's no dead pedal, so there's really nowhere to rest your left foot. That's one thing. This is a little bit worse than the Porsche is the general ergonomics. It's a lot tighter in here. There's no room for your left foot and things like that, so it's definitely a smaller space than the Porsche is. One cool thing about the car is let me hop out so that hopefully we can get a little bit more light in here. Ooh. Okay, that's a little bit better. One neat thing about this car is just how simple it is. Again, there is no electronic controls, there's no screen, nothing like that. And there's even less equipment than the Porsche. There's no memory seats, so there's no buttons down there. There are no features. There's no extra things. So there's only a handful of buttons in here. The buttons around the stereo there are actually the window up and down switches. So there's nothing on the center console except leather. On the steering wheel, you've got some controls for your wipers and your lights and your horn, windshield wipers, and the wash button is over there. TVR was actually the first company, or one of the first companies, that started putting buttons on the steering wheel. This car came out in 1996 with these buttons on the steering wheel, and at that time hardly anybody else was doing anything like that. Even Ferrari did not have buttons on their steering wheels until much later. So it's cool that they got rid of a lot of stuff and basically just have the basics in here. So it's a driver's car. You know, you have what you need to drive the car and a couple of comforts like the power windows and the stereo, but that's it. There's nothing else. And that's so cool in a way, and they just don't make cars like that anymore. So back to the buttons. I mean, there's literally one button for your windshield wipers. It's not even a stock. So you just push the button once, the wipers come on. You want them to go faster, you push it again. And you want them to go faster, you push it again. And then you want it off, you push it again. So it's literally one button for the windshield wipers. And then there's your horn, your brights, things like that. So it's just, they made it so simple and so unique. This is actually an air vent there, so that's really neat. You can point it right at your face, and there's nothing in your way. You know, most cars you have the vent over here and over there, and you try to point at your face, and it hits the cold air hits your hands on the steering wheel and freezes your hands. But with TVR, they've got that vent down there, and they did that with a couple of other models as well. They had some vents underneath the bottom of the wheel there. This car, let me go over to the other side. So you remember how in the Porsche I could fit the big car seat back here, and this is actually a full car seat with the back on it. It just barely fits in there and just barely hits the roof line. Well, with the TVR, well, I mean, maybe you could fit a car seat in there, but I haven't found one yet. So I have this little inflatable one called the Bubble Bum. So that's my daughter's car seat, and the seat belts go through there. And there's no back. If I tried to fit that other car seat in here, this seat is so shallow, and it kind of curves in there a lot, that if I try to fit the car seat in there, it actually just kind of falls off. And I can't even push the car seat back all the way. So this is just her booster seat, and then her head is up here by the headrest, so she's good. But you remember one thing I liked about the Porsche was you could do this one-handed. You pull that thing and you can move the seat with one hand. With the TVR, it's not quite as simple. You have to reach down here with one hand and pull that lever, and at the same time you gotta move that seat forward. Well, that time it moved forward all by itself, but sometimes you kind of have to push it with your hand to get it to go. But the TVR has this big old cubby in the back there too. You could store stuff back there. It's a giant cubby hole. So again, going back to the thing I said about the kind of race car theme, with this TVR, not only does it have a tubular steel chassis kind of running down the middle here, and that chassis also comes up, and there's some bars that go kind of crossways through there in the back. But also, this car, because it has that tubular steel chassis, they just built in a roll cage into the car's body. So this big tube up there that's covered in leather is actually the bars of the roll cage. Same thing here, goes down along the A-pillars, and then you can see that roll cage continues going backwards. There's a cross member up here in the middle of the car, and then it continues going down where that light is, and it goes down into the cross members that go this way. So this car actually has a full roll cage, and that is built in as part of the car's frame. Now, it's not full like a race car where they have the bars here going across the windows, because, you know, this is a road car. That stuff would get in the way. So it's not like a full race car style, but it's still pretty darn close. I cannot think of another car, none that I know of, that actually have a roll cage built into the car from the factory. You know, a road car. I can't think of any. As far as I know, this is the only one. I mean, that is how race car the TVR Cerbera is. And again, there's no driver aids, no anti-lock brakes, no airbags, no nothing. Oh, kind of like the Porsche. Again, no cup holders because sports car. And no glove box either because sports car. You do have these little door pockets, but these door pockets are pretty darn tiny. I mean, I could barely fit 2 fingers in there. I can fit my envelope with my insurance, and I kind of throw the cigarette lighter piece in there, and even the cigarette lighter just barely fits in there. So those are pretty tiny pockets. I don't know if I showed you the doors very well. You know, the body is smooth, so there's no door handle. So to get into the car, there's a button under the wing mirror here. You press that button and the computer will lower the window a little bit to clear the seals there. And then the computer will also pop open the door with a little actuator that's hidden inside the body there. So it's just one button. Pretty cool. So that's the interior. I mean, there's actually not much to see in there other than, you know, the one advantage that this car has, or the plus, I guess you could say, over the Porsche, is the general look of this interior. You have that leather covering almost every surface, you know, other than the carpet. And you have those aluminum knobs and switchgear, and everything is bespoke, made just for this car. Whereas the Porsche has, you know, kind of that simple plastic dash with the black plastic buttons. So the interior in here is not as nice, but the interior for the Porsche does have the ergonomics. I mean, it's way more ergonomic than the TVR is. After I drive the TVR for more than like 30 minutes, my left leg starts to ache because there's just nowhere to put my leg and my foot. And it is pretty tight in here. Like I mentioned before, it's pretty tight. So you can get a little bit cramped, but you know, once you kind of get situated, you just kind of sit in there and drive and relax. The window is pretty shallow, so you do have to, you know, stop a little bit away from the stoplight so that you can see the stoplight. Otherwise the roof would be, you know, covering half of your vision. So you can either, you know, stop a little bit farther away or push the seat back a little bit so you can see farther out. But you know, once you're in there, there's headroom and everything. It's just that the roof is pretty low. Let's take a look at the trunks. I do love this sound too. When you move the seat back, I mean, it just clicks in there. That's that quality, that German quality. So yeah, I mean, you can tell the Porsche may not be as nice looking as the TVR. You know, it kind of looks like an older car with the older plastic interior. But the Porsche is just so much more ergonomic, and you just reach everything, and you got that dead pedal to rest your foot. You got plenty of headspace. The windows are pretty large, and I mean, you have no trouble seeing out of these windows, and it's just great visibility. Oh, you know how the TVR had the window switches right next to the stereo there in the middle? They're not on the doors, they're by the stereo. The Porsche has a kind of weird thing going on too. the window switches are there in the center, right next to the ashtray. So you got the front windows, and if this was a convertible, it would also have the back windows right there. Okay, so I said we were gonna look at the trunks real quick. Porsche has this little electronic switch. Cool thing about Porsche is they have this build sticker. I'm trying to get it to focus. But yeah, you can put in those codes into a computer or a system, and it'll tell you all the options that came on this car. So that's pretty cool. This stereo code, that's kind of a fun story. When I bought this car, they had disconnected the battery, at some point while they were working on it and selling it. So the stereo came up with the code needed. Because, back in the 90s, if someone stole your stereo, you would have that code that you have to type in to turn the stereo back on as a theft deterrent, and you just use the buttons in there. Well, obviously I didn't know that code because it was a used car. So I did some research online, and it turns out, you need the stereo serial number and model, and you can see the model just by looking at the stereo. But the serial number, some people are saying, oh, you have to take the stereo out. You got to look at it on the little barcode on the back of the stereo. Well, apparently I did a little bit more research, and you just have to type in a certain series of buttons on that stereo, and then the stereo will display the serial number. And then I went to the manufacturer's website, Becker. It's a Becker stereo, and it's an old company. They made these stereos originally for Porsche. And so I clicked on the button that said lost stereo code, and it took me to this page that was like an eBay sellers page. It was the Becker eBay page, and it said, hey, send us an email with your stereo serial number and your make and model of it, and then we'll send you the stereo code. And I was like, this seems kind of weird, kind of fishy. It's this old looking eBay website. But I did it. I sent them my stereo code and the serial number and all that, and they sent me an email saying, hey, your stereo code is 4741. And then about a week later, they sent the actual little metal card in the mail that has my stereo code on it, so I can keep it with the owner's manual. But so I went back to the car, and I typed in that code on the stereo, and then bam, the stereo started playing, like it was brand new. And that's just that's how cool this car is. I mean, even though it's 22 years old, this thing just still works as if it's brand new. I typed in that stereo code that I got from Becker, and the stereo turned right back on. It's so cool. And so I wrote that up there. A lot of guys write that stereo code on that sticker there. So anyway, that's just a fun story. Let's see, trying to get some light in here. I guess it's not a whole lot of light. I think the light turned off because it's been open for a bit. But yeah, there's a pretty deep trunk in there. And then you got some fluids up here, and the battery is up there. So this makes it pretty convenient to hook up the battery cable. The TVR's trunk, I think they're roughly the same size. I think the TVR's trunk is about the same size as the Porsche's. So obviously trunk in the back like a normal car, or typical car, I guess. It's probably kind of dark. Here's another fun story. So the TVR's fuel filler is here, hidden underneath the trunk lid, so there's nothing messing up the lines on the side of the car. And of course the Porsche, because the engine's in the back, the fuel tank is here in the front, and so the fuel filler is right there. I think it says Dren bis Klick. I guess that means tighten until click in German, but I always think that's kind of funny. So the funny thing is, with the TVR, you know, you pull up to a gas pump, and of course you're driving on that side, and the fuel fillers are usually on the passenger side, I guess, in most cars. So you drive up to the fuel pump, and you try to get as close as you can to the pump, but the tank here is almost all the way in the back of the car, and then you open up the trunk, and you know, it looks like you're filling your trunk with gas or something. And then of course the whole rest of the car is sticking out in front of the pump. And you know, if you could probably park it right in the middle, and it might reach, you know, the hose, but still with this car driving on the right side, and you know, trying to be careful not to hit the fuel pump, you know, sometimes I just kind of drive up a little far, so this car kind of sticks out outside the fuel pump, and then your fuel filler's there. And then with this car, with the Porsche, it's the total opposite. You know, the fuel filler's here, so I might park next to the fuel pump there, and only a little bit is sticking out. And then you got the whole rest of the car sticking out the back. And so sometimes I'll be parked at a fuel pump right here, and some car will drive in, you know, thinking that there's nobody here, and they almost hit me, and they have to go back up and go to some other fuel pump. You know, that happened to me one time. But still, you know, you could probably park with the fuel pump here, and the hose would reach. But, you know, it's just because of that one time when you don't get close enough, and then you have to get all the way back in the car and start it and roll up 2 feet, and then you got to get back out and pump the gas, and it's just kind of annoying. So, you know, I kind of park near the pump. But anyway, I just thought it was funny that both of these cars have fuel fillers in weird spots. The TVR, it's in the trunk, and in the Porsche, it's all the way up here in the front of the car, where you wouldn't normally expect a fuel filler to be. So yeah, that's the trunks and the interiors. So I'll open up the hoods now in a second, and we can see the engines. You know, one nice thing about the Porsche is, because the battery is up here in the front, you could jump start the car by opening the hood and plugging up to the battery there underneath the cover. But also, Porsche puts a little remote battery terminal back here where the engine is. So with the Porsche, you could actually jump start the car from either end. So that's kind of fun. But with the TVR, the battery is up here with the engine, like, you know, most cars. So you would jump start the TVR from up here like you would typically. But with the Porsche, you could jump start the car from either end. So that's kind of neat. Let me put the phone down, and I'll open up the engines. Okay, so the Porsche has, again, another little electronic switch right there, which pops open the engine cover. I guess you don't call it a hood because it's, you know, this little bitty thing in the back. So I suppose you call it an engine cover and not a hood. Feels weird calling it a hood. But the nice thing is Porsche gives you this light in here in the engine bay. So you got your fan there, which it doesn't cool the engine, it really just kind of helps cool the engine bay. The engine has radiators and fans up at the front of the car that cool the engine, but this fan is really just for the engine bay itself. With this 996, unlike some of the newer Porsches, you can actually see a lot of the engine in here. If I zoom out a little bit, yeah, you can see the alternator kind of down there. You can check your oil right there, or you can just use the electronic gauge that's inside the instrument cluster. Got your coolant level there and your air intake, and then you got your air filter over there. Everything in here is stock too, by the way. This car is basically 100% stock. And so, I don't know if you can see, but the air intake is kind of in the back there behind the throttle body there, and then it's a flat 6, of course, so the cylinders are down low, and then the transaxle is further up. So yeah, the engine is in the back, kind of weird, but you know, it's the 911 way. So there you go. The TVR, so this car, the hood opens up towards the front, like a Corvette and some other cars. So the first thing you might notice about this car, well, first of all, is that bright neon green paint color. Obviously, that's not stock. The engines are, you know, usually a kind of silver, you know, gunmetal, you know, typical engine color. And then these intakes here are usually black. You know, those are just plastic, or I think they're plastic intakes. So you got your intake and air filter over there. Then you got these big giant air intakes that lead to the throttle bodies, and then they go down into the engine. The alternator sits there in the valley, and one neat thing about this engine, like I said before, it's not like a typical V8. This is like a 75-degree V8 with a flat plane crank, and you know, individual throttle bodies. And when you look at the front of the engine, you can see there's not even any pulleys on there except for the one down at the bottom. This car used to have air conditioning, and that pulley down there at the bottom would normally run the air conditioner. A lot of guys sometimes just remove them, you know, when they just start to have problems with the 25-year-old car air conditioning. So a lot of guys just remove the air conditioner. So that's what happened to mine. It's got that pulley down there that doesn't do anything now. The alternator's kind of way back there, and everything else is attached to the sides of the engine and driven by the gears inside the engine itself. This is a TVR engine. It was designed by Al Melling for TVR, and he is an engine designer who's worked on all kinds of engines, a lot of race engines, Formula One engines, things like that. The other thing you'll notice is it's got, you know, these nice panels inside here kind of covering up everything, so it almost looks like the body continues into the engine bay. But you can kind of see the chassis down there. So this car had a body off restoration, so they removed the body from the steel chassis, and then they kind of recoated and painted the chassis, and that's why it's green down there, and they painted a couple other things to match. So when you see that bright green paint, it kind of shows off that they basically redid this entire car. But the other thing you'll notice is, you know, how far back that engine is. You know, there's the wheel there, and the engine is totally behind it. So this car has pretty close to 50-50 weight distribution. So the engine, or the transmission, of course, is way back here, basically inside the car, and that's why the transmission tunnel is so large. And like I said, you can see it better from back here. That's why I got that large transmission tunnel in there. And then, of course, the steel backbone that runs through the car. And yeah, it has that 50-50 weight distribution. And then going back to the rear wheels there. So, yeah, like I said, you know, even with a stock exhaust, these cars are just pretty loud. And they have a sound that's like no other car. And the thing about this engine is it revs up super quick. I mean, if you just touch the gas pedal, I mean, the engine just revs right up. I mean, it almost sounds like it's barking because it revs up so quickly. It does make it a little bit hard to shift gears and match the revs, but I probably just need to get used to it, because I've only had this car for about a month or so now, and I've only driven it a few times, so I'm sure I'll get used to that. But the engine revs up super quick. Yeah, that's pretty much the two engines there. And of course the Porsche with its little bitty engine cover and everything kind of crammed in there. But you can work on the Porsche basically from the bottom. You know, you can get to everything on this car. Everything's kind of in a weird spot with this car too. Like that cap down there is the windshield wash, and then there's another cap over here. That is the power steering fluid, and then the oil filler is that cap that's kind of sticking out the front of the engine there. And then of course you got brake fluid there, because you're on the right side of the car. That cap way over there in the corner is the coolant, way over there. And of course you got your radiators in the typical spot, and I don't know how well it comes across on the camera, but when you're standing next to this car, that radiator is way down there. I mean, it looks like the radiator is, you know, 1 foot on top of the floor. That's how low that thing is. And then there's actually kind of like a valley in here where the chassis is, and then you have the engine pushed back so far. This is the only car that has this engine. The Cerbera has the TVR V8 engine called the AJP8. They did also use these in the TVR race cars called the Tuscan Challenge cars. They used a version of this engine, and they also built a larger engine a little bit later. But yeah, as far as the TVR V8, this is the only car that has this engine. So pretty neat. Okay, I do have to show you one more thing, and then I'll give you some closing thoughts. Okay, I showed you the TVR's party piece, the doors, the way that they open with that little hidden switch. I forgot to show you the Porsche's party piece. So the Porsche has this little spoiler here. I mean, these vents let the air into the engine bay to help cool the engine bay, but you also have this little lip of a spoiler. And there's a really neat story of the designer, Pinky Lai, when they were in the air tunnel trying to achieve the numbers that they wanted for this car. You know, he kind of used the clay and put a little spoiler right here, and he ran it in the air tunnel, in the wind tunnel, and then he found that that was helping give the car a little bit more downforce, which they needed in the back of the car. And then he tried to make that lip a little bit bigger, and he did it again, and it worked better, and he kept making it bigger and bigger. So eventually he wanted this wing to basically be able to move up, and he wanted them to develop that for the car, and he kind of had to convince them to spend the extra funding to develop that movable wing piece. But in the end they did, and so this thing is pretty neat. I mean, this car came out in well, the earliest year of this model came out, I think, in 98 or 99, and this had this movable, deploying rear wing, kind of like the newer cars, like the McLarens and the Veyrons, and they all have those deploying wings. But this thing had it in 1998 and 99. So this particular car is a 2001. But it's pretty neat that they had that movable wing way back then. So let me show you how that works. I'll turn on the power. And so now the power's on. There is a hidden switch down here, and when you press it, that wing can deploy. So yeah, so the wing pops out. The reason there's that switch there is just so you can, move that wing up for when you're cleaning around the car. Normally you wouldn't use that switch. But that wing deploys all by itself whenever you hit 75 miles an hour, and then the wing will just stay up the whole time to give you that downforce. And then the wing will automatically go back down whenever you drop below 35 miles per hour. I think it also depends maybe on the temperature as well, but that wing comes up and down automatically just whenever you're driving. So one of the cool things is that when I'm driving here, my daughter, who likes to go for rides in the sports cars, she'll be sitting here in the back, and I'll kind of be looking at that speedometer, and I'll be accelerating up to 70 and getting close to 75 on the highway. And as soon as I start getting close to 75, I have to yell at her, "Penny, watch the spoiler!" And she'll kind of turn, and she'll have to lift herself up a little bit, looking out that window, and you can barely see the lip of the spoiler from inside the car. And she says, "Daddy, I see the wing, I see the wing!" And so that's always fun. And sometimes she'll tell me to pop the wing up, at other times, just to see it. But that wing is pretty cool, I have to admit. The TVR doesn't have any moving body panels, but that wing is pretty cool. Oh, they also have a brake light in there, so when the wing pops up and it covers that brake light, it has another brake light right there in the wing. German engineering right there. So anyway, that's the Porsche's party piece. And there's those orange and red gauges again, like a stealth bomber or something. I don't know what color gauges they actually have, but I just pretend it's the same. Anyway, yeah, let me deactivate that and let me get this car turned off, and then I'll do some final thoughts. Okay, so I wanted to do just some closing thoughts and my thoughts in general on these two cars. So, again, I like these cars because of that era that they come from, the simple sports car, before all of the crazy amount of technology started getting inserted into vehicles. And I like that both these cars are lightweight and rear wheel drive. The engines sound good. They're just pure sports cars. So I like both of them. I'd have to say though that the Porsche is, like, on the sports car spectrum, the Porsche is closer to a normal car. Meaning that it has air conditioning. It's got the automatic climate control. It has the anti-lock brakes and the traction controls. It's got the airbags. It's got more space, more headroom. It's all around just a little bit more usable than the TVR is. The Porsche is the kind of car where you can kind of hop in. You don't really have to worry about it. It'll go wherever you need it to go. It'll get you there. It's fun, but it's not scary. It's fast enough to be fun, and it's so reliable that you don't even have to worry about it. It's just that kind of car. And of course, being a Porsche 911, it drives so well. And like I mentioned before, the way that the engine and the transmission work together, and they're so easy, to match revs and to drive it. The lightweight steering, that weight over the rear wheels, giving it nice traction. It's The 911 is the whole package. Um, Heck, you even have luggage space in the trunk. It's got the small rear seats. At least you can fit a child back there. They're not really big enough for adults. You definitely can't fit an adult back there, but a child, yeah. So, you got the sunroof for when, it's nice out and you want to open that up. I take my daughter for rides in it. I also like driving this car home for the holidays. I trust this car to go on a long journey. So my parents live in Central Texas, and I usually drive this car to go home for the holidays, Christmas and Thanksgiving and all that. And I even fit a little tiny Christmas tree in the back here one time, a little parcel shelf back there. So you can fit stuff in here too. And I brought that little Christmas tree back home in this car. So it's just the perfect sports car. It's fast, but it's not crazy, and it's just enough. And that I think is really the best thing about the 911. I mean, yeah, the Porsche 911 has what, 50 something years of history of winning races and being, a great sports car, probably the best sports car, really. I mean, a lot of other cars kind of measure themselves against the 911. And when you look at that car, you can, I mean, that body shape just reminds you of the 50 something years of 911 history. And you're kind of aware of that when you see it, and when you see the badge, and you just know that there is so much history and so many years of perfecting this design. So the Porsche 911, in many ways is just kind of the perfect little sports car. It may not be the fastest, may not be the loudest, but it's just so good, possibly the best sports car. I think a lot of people would probably agree. And in the same way, the TVR, I like this car because it is in a way usable too. I mean, this does have, your small seats in the back where I can take my daughter for a ride. It's got the trunk where you can fit stuff in there. But whereas the Porsche is kind of almost an everyday car, or could be used as an everyday car, the TVR is not quite like that. I wouldn't use this car every day. The TVR on the sports car spectrum, I would say, is farther away from being a normal car. It's like closer to that, like I said before, the race car idea. This is way closer to, I mean, maybe not race car level, but it's crazier. You know what I mean? The TVR is, I mean, when you get in it and you start it and it's loud and you really need to pay attention when you're driving, so you don't, there's no traction control or anything, and it's a very lightweight car. So you got to pay attention when you're driving. So when I'm driving this car, I am literally concentrating just on the drive. And it's fun, and it's visceral, and it's loud, and the engine's making noises, and the drivetrain's making noises, and there's stuff vibrating. It's just, I guess the best word for it is crazy. It's a sports car, but it's like a sports car to the extreme. So this car, I don't know if I would, drive this across Texas to my parents' house for the holidays, like I do with this one. This car is more the Sunday morning, I want to go for a drive in the country, or I want to go for a drive just for the sake of driving. And I want that crazy sports car experience. This car is in that area. So that's kind of the difference between these two cars. They're both great. They're both great, but this one is almost more of a normal car, and the TVR is it's like a race car for the road, but with leather seats, with that nice interior, the nice styling. So that's kind of how I would describe that. It's like a race car for the road for those special occasions when you want a car that is just crazy compared to any other car. And the experience of driving this car is, like nothing else. I've driven a handful, and I've owned a handful of cars like this. The older cars with less electronic aids. I have driven a handful of other cars that are similar to these, very lightweight, no driver aids. So I know how to drive these. But even still, the TVR is just, I guess you could say, scary or crazy. It's like a whole nother level. So that's the difference between these two cars. But if you want that experience, that crazy sports car experience that is like nothing else, in a car that looks like nothing else, the TVR Cerbera is it. To be honest, if you drive the 911, you would see how good it drives, how well it drives, and how fast you can drive in it. Kind of because it's so comfortable and so easy to drive. You can almost drive it a little bit faster on in the daily life, But then on the open road, the TVR would be way faster. And if you were to hop out of the Porsche and hop into the TVR, the difference is night and day. Even though the Porsche is hardly a normal car, it's like it's a top level sports car. But when you hop into the TVR, it's a whole different world. The TVR makes this car feel and seem like it's a normal everyday thing, and it really isn't. That's just how other level the TVR is. That's really my first impression of this car. So both of these cars are good in their own way. They're both similar, in terms of that lightweight, simple, back to the basics, old school sports car with this classic and elegant styling. They're both like that, so they're both good cars. I would say that the TVR is more crazy, and the Porsche is more normal, I guess you could say. Or maybe not as much of an event as the TVR is. Even though the Porsche has those quirks, like, the rear engine and the starter on the left-hand side, like the old Le Mans style, still, even though this car is pretty cool and pretty unique, the TVR is it's just a whole nother level. So, I guess the conclusion is I like both of these cars, but they fill different purposes. I like them for different reasons. And so there you go. Anyway, I Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found it entertaining. Hope you learned a few things. And any questions or concerns, just leave a comment for me. Alright. Thanks for watching, everybody. See ya.